Our first speaker is Nick Byrd from Carnegie Mellon University, and Nick's talk is titled Your Health versus My Liberty, Philosophical Beliefs, Dominated Reflection, and Identifiable Victim Effects when Predicting Public Health Recommendation Compliance.
Okay, so I guess I'll share my screen. Great. Hopefully you're seeing slides now. Yeah, so today I wanted to talk about some experimental work I did with Mial Bialik during the COVID-19 pandemic, funded in part by Florida State University, which is where I was at the time. And the project actually started on Twitter. I was running a poll and I wanted to know if sharing stories about the COVID-19 pandemic would be more motivating than sharing the usual flatten the curves graphs that I was seeing so often. And after I learned that most people thought that the stories would be more motivating, Michal pointed out that this actually kind of aligns with the identifiable victim effect as construed by people like Paul Slovic. And I confessed that I would expect the identifiable victim effect to work during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I thought, look, if we do depict victims kind of in individual identifiable ways, then that probably would motivate people to comply more with public health recommendations than these flatten the curve graphs that I'm seeing everywhere. But I also thought, well, some people actually might be more motivated by the flattening the curve graphs, depending on how they reason, and maybe especially like if they understand exponential curves and other mathematical features of the graphs. But I became tempted to kind of test these expectations, and Hall was on board. So I reallocated some funds from a bunch of canceled conferences and put them towards a couple experiments. So just in case the identifiable victim effect is new to anyone, just here's some background. So there's a decades-long history of people, of expecting people to care more about identifiable victims than statistical victims. So Ross and Nisbet tell us that Joseph Stalin said, "The death of a single Russian soldier is a tragedy, but 1,000,000 deaths is just a statistic." And Paul Slovic, who I mentioned earlier, cites a series of papers as finding that, in his words, people are much more willing to aid identified individuals than unidentified or statistical individuals. This is his work on psychic numbing. And people here are probably familiar with some of the philosophers who are troubled by our remarkably ineffective responses to victims around the world. And they argue that we have a duty to do better. Many of these philosophers call themselves effective altruists. And one famous argument for effective altruism comes from Peter Singer in a 1972 paper that you're probably all familiar with. And there's this key premise in that paper that goes like this: if it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, then we ought morally to do it. So now consider all of that in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So public health officials are recommending low risk, straightforward methods for preventing millions of deaths during the COVID-19 pandemic. But some leaders and individuals seem fatally resistant to these recommendations, and we were curious as to why. So based on what I just told you, we naturally thought, well, perhaps it's the messaging from public health officials and leaders, right? These flatten the curve graphs focus more on statistical victims than identifiable victims, and therefore they're just not as motivating as messages that would focus on individual or identifiable victims. But you might also think, well, a lot of leaders were comparing COVID-19 to the seasonal flu during the pandemic. And even though their public health officials had debunked the comparison, and the worry is that by comparing the COVID-19 to the flu, we're actually decreasing compliance with public health recommendations, which would actually potentially increase COVID-19 deaths. And people's responses to these messages were mixed, right? So lots of people seemed to comply with these recommendations, but there were some conspiracy theories and other forms of misinformation about COVID-19 that may have reduced the perceived threat of the pandemic, especially among people who don't reason as reflectively as some other people. Also, there were some political blocs in multiple countries who were protesting government's attempts to stop the spread of COVID-19. And certain religious groups in certain countries continued to hold crowded services despite the known risk to public health. And so, there's this, it raises the question, why would otherwise life-affirming people resist easy to adopt, expert recommended practices when so many lives had already been lost and so many more lives were still at stake? And, based on the kind of research and reporting I've alluded to so far, it seems like there's kind of three factors you could point to. One is public health messaging. The next one is the public's reasoning. And then the third would just be the public's prior philosophical beliefs. So in April and May of 2020, my collaborator and I decided that we would test the identifiable victim effect as well as these flu comparisons while controlling for people's reasoning and their prior philosophical beliefs. So first, participants were just shown a list of public health officials' recommendations, similar to what we've all seen, right? They recommend things like hand washing and mask wearing and staying at home unless you have some essential activity outside the home. And then participants are randomly assigned to one of four messaging conditions in a kind of 2x2 between subjects design. And so each visual message was about either a statistical victim or, statistical victims or identifiable victim. And it was about either a COVID-19 or a flu pandemic. And our primary outcome variable was a validated compliance measure from Jim Everett and colleagues. And the scale just asked participants about the likelihood that they're going to follow the 5 most common public health recommendations. And Anton Gollwitzer and colleagues have actually found that scales like this predict actual social distancing behavior at the population level. So participants were also asked to rate their perceived threat of the pandemic, since this has actually predicted quite a lot of variance in compliance with public health recommendations in prior research. And there's also some evidence that identifiable victim effects can be moderated by reasoning style. So as you may know, psychologists have come up with tests of various types of reasoning styles, such as reflective or unreflective reasoning. One somewhat famous question from a test like this goes as follows. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball, so how much does the ball cost? And most people find that what comes to participants' mind first is this answer 10 cents. But of course, upon reflection, you can realize that's actually not quite right, and 5 cents is the correct answer. And so this test is supposed to test our reflection, how reflectively we reason, because it lures us towards a particular response that upon reflection, we can realize is actually incorrect. Now, in our studies, we had participants complete less familiar questions like this and also less mathematical questions like this, so that we weren't just testing, say, mathematical competence. But in study 2, we actually did include an independent measure of mathematical competence, since like I alluded to earlier, that might have been involved in the way that people process graphs, like flatten the curve graphs. So then participants completed a battery of philosophical items. Most of these were adapted from Bourget and Chalmers' Phil Papers survey questions. So they're just kind of like modified to be more standard language and less jargony versions of the questions, as well as some other validated questions like the religiosity question here, and then the effective altruism question, which, like I mentioned earlier, was adapted from Peter Singer's 1972 paper. So the first experiment took place in April, and it had 246 English fluent US adults that passed Cloud Research's data quality checks as well as our own attention check. And we used just the effective altruism question in the philosophy battery for this first experiment because we weren't quite sure how much predictive power these philosophy items would have, and you have to pay people for the length of the survey, right? So we were going for a more cost-effective initial experiment. And then the next experiment took place in May, and we wanted to triple the sample size so we could have a lot more power to detect small effects. So we had about 752 participants who passed all the same data quality checks. We included that independent measure of numeracy that I mentioned, as well as the full battery of philosophy items, which is roughly a dozen philosophy questions. So now for the results. Replicating past work, we found that the public health compliance items actually correlated very strongly with one another. In other words, they have like good internal reliability. They also correlated well with perceived threat of the pandemic. And compliance was higher among older people and women. And reflection test performance actually didn't correlate well with compliance. But again, this just replicates some other work that was going on at the time. The thing that really stood out to us is that effective altruism was by far the strongest predictor of compliance with public health officials' recommendations. So then we wanted to kind of control for all of those factors at the same time using hierarchical regression. So what you're seeing here is 3 different models. A model that just uses the messaging variables to predict compliance and threat, and then one that uses messaging and reasoning. And on the far right 2 columns, you're seeing all of the variables. And we detected a small identifiable victim effect until we introduced the philosophy items. And we also found a larger effect of messaging about flu, which was that it kind of reduced perceived threat of the pandemic, but it didn't seem to have a direct impact on compliance. We also found that reflection test performance still wasn't very related to perceived threat after you introduced the effective altruist principle, which in this hierarchical regression, again, was a rather strong predictor of complying with public health recommendations and a strong predictor of perceived threat of the pandemic. So this was our first clue that we should probably be including more philosophy items because that seems to be what's doing the predictive work here. So in study 2, we included a lot more philosophy items. Here's the full correlation table, but we're just going to zoom in on some of the more important stuff. Again, the compliance with public health items correlated strongly with one another, as well as perceived threat of the pandemic. It also correlated with people's age, so compliance was higher among older people, and reflection test performance didn't correlate well with compliance once again. And once again, the effective altruism principle or agreement with it was the strongest predictor of compliance. But scientific realism, agreeing that the entities and processes and scientific theories are probably true, also predicted compliance with public health recommendations. And the best predictor of non-compliance with these recommendations was preferring liberty to equality, or in particular, thinking that liberty is more important for a society than equality is. So this kind of confirmed our suspicion that philosophical preferences were doing more predictive work than either messaging or reasoning. But again, we wanted to control for all these variables at once to see if that held up. And once again, we're finding that no really detectable identifiable victim effect. We did still find that messaging about flu reduced perceived threat of the pandemic, but it didn't really have a direct impact on compliance. Reflections test performance was still not predicting compliance much. But again, effective altruism is still the best predictor of complying with these recommendations, as is scientific realism. And slightly less predictive, but still predictive, was religiosity. And then again, the strongest predictor of not complying was preferring liberty to equality.
Hey, Nick, you've got about a minute left.
Great. So now you might want to know whether the messaging changed our control variables, producing kind of multiple colliding effects on the compliance outcome that we were testing. So to look at this, you can run mediation. And this is just a visualization of what that test would look like, and I guess the outcome of that test in our data on experiment 2. And this revealed a pretty similar picture. So messaging about flu actually did reduce compliance indirectly by reducing perceived threat of the pandemic. So people who got the flu messaging were just less concerned about the pandemic and therefore less likely to comply with public health recommendations. Moreover, when we control for all of these factors, we found that the philosophical differences are actually still predicting a lot of variance in compliance, suggesting that they're still doing a lot of work even when we control for all of these other factors in the mediation model. So together, we think that the data suggests that flouting public health recommendations is probably less about ineffective statistical messaging or reasoning than people's prior philosophical beliefs. And then these data seem to lend credence to the concern that those who compared COVID-19 to the flu may have increased people's risk of infection and death by reducing public health compliance, by indirectly reducing the perceived threat of the pandemic. So I'll stop there and open it to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nick.
Okay, and I've received nothing on chat, so if people want to put their hands up or put up a chat, and I'll call it from there. Rosalind, yes.
I thought that was very interesting. Thank you. And a question that I had, though, is, you know, the effective altruism message. It's interesting to me that when I've had conversations with students about it, that very often when you put it the way that you described it, you know, in your question, they all, oh, yes, yes, yes. But the minute that we start to talk about specifics as to what does that imply, then they get off the, you know, then they start disagreeing. And so I'm wondering whether it's really, you know, if you have any thoughts about that, maybe let me just leave it open-ended.
Yeah, so I completely agree with you, and that totally matches my experience. When I was telling my spouse about these results and I told her about the effective altruism principle, she's like, yeah, obviously we should do that. And I was like, so then we should be sacrificing tons of our time and money to help people who are like experiencing something far worse than us giving up our wealth and time. And she was like, well, I don't know. And so, you know, it sounds like intuitively plausible until you consider the implications. So I have no doubt that something like that would happen with the participants. And so I'd be kind of curious to know what you would find if you could basically rerun the experiment, but kind of force people to reflect a bit more on each of these philosophical principles and their implications. I'm currently doing work right now where we get people to engage in experiments where they either think out loud on their own or think together with a partner, sometimes a partner who disagrees with them. And so it'd be interesting to kind of rerun some of this work in those settings where people maybe are more likely to realize the implications and then maybe have the chance to back off from their agreement, or maybe double down, I don't know, to see what results change, if at all. So I take the point, and I think it'd be interesting to investigate it empirically.
Okay. Eric asked a question via chat, whether Nick was surprised by any of the results.
I'm really sorry if I just
Oh, sorry, Nick. Yeah, a question for you from Eric Dickman. Were you surprised by any of the results?
Right. So and there was that other question right before I dropped my microphone. Sorry about that. I'm guessing you can still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Sorry about that. So the first question for Creighton, I'm not quite sure why participants were embracing the principles that they were. Some of them sort of make sense, right? So there were some political items in there like social conservatism versus economic conservatism, and those correlated as you would expect with some of the other items like liberty versus equality. And so you could probably draw some intuitive stories about why people are drawn to one of the other principles based on their agreement or disagreement with the other principles. And Justin's question, is there a relationship between philosophical beliefs about liberty and effective altruism? Yeah, I could try to put up the screen again, but I can just try to find the correlation table here. So economic liberty correlated with, what was the other variable? Effective altruism. So 11 and 13. So there's a negative correlation. So the more that people endorsed effective altruism, the less likely they were to prefer liberty over equality.
Can I follow up on that? Because I mean, there are different conceptions of liberty out there, so I mean, I guess what that suggests to me is just what it indicates what those folks mean by liberty. Right, because you might think, I mean, there should really be no relationship between beliefs about liberty and beliefs about altruism. You can think, liberty is really important, and I use that liberty and to help other people, right? But so and what that relation suggests to me is just a particular characterization of liberty. Am I on that?
Yeah, so the effective altruism principle does imply a pretty strong duty to others, which I think, well, the libertarians I know don't have that sense of duty to others.
But it's an equal duty. I mean, it's not like it doesn't imply it to say that, you know, these equal obligations are important. Not to say anything about the role of government or coercive measure or anything. That I could say, yeah, should be free to help people and I show other people.
Yeah, I'm not sure I caught all that. The audio, at least on my end, is kind of distorted. So yeah, so there's a distinction between the liberty you have between your relationship with government and maybe other forms of liberty. And it might be that during the COVID-19 pandemic, the type of liberty that people were primed to think about was the liberty they have from things like mask mandates and the like, as opposed to other forms of liberty. And so, yeah, so I have no, I think your hypothesis seems totally plausible. I guess I'm also thinking that there, at least anecdotally, I experience libertarians who are pretty resistant to the idea of having duty to others, even before I ever bring up the government. Like when I just say, like, should you be required to help people in other parts of the world if you can prevent, you know, great harm without causing yourself or anyone else as much harm? And they say, like, no, like that's why I'm not an effective altruist. So I wonder if it would work on multiple conceptions of liberty. But I mean, it's an empirical question, so it seems like another thing worth investigating.
Should we go to Bill Davis's question next? Do we have comparable study data on the effectiveness of messaging in a less politicized situation? Do your findings suggest we should devote fewer resources to messaging campaigns?
So there's a meta-analysis of the identifiable victim effect from like 2016. I think it's by Lee and Feely. And they found across a bunch of different studies an effect size of 0.09 to 0.11, which would be considered either small or null, depending on who you ask. And the largest effects in that meta-analysis were on studies that looked at donation behavior. So you don't have to like act, you just have to give a certain amount of money. And those were the ones that had the strongest identifiable victim effect. So it might be that like we're more willing to do things that make us feel like we've done the right thing without having to exert much effort, like sending a check or whatever, versus like actually having to put on a mask or stay in the house and like something that affects our like day-to-day activity. And then you might also think, actually, if this effect is so small, maybe there's just not an identifiable victim effect. I mean, we didn't find one, but we didn't run 40-something studies like the meta-analysis analyzed.